Labor unions in this country really came to the fore between 1830 and 1860 with the Industrial Revolution. They did not have an auspicious beginning in the United States, given our Puritan work ethic and history.
As a democracy, we believe in individualism, and we say everybody should take care of himself, and that collective action is always frowned upon. Because collective action, workers coming together to discuss and to work on their problems, is suspicious. Labor unions are not liked by a whole lot of people in this country, and yet they've had such an enormous impact.
Most of the people in this country, certainly the majority, realize that it was labor unions, led by rail labor unions, that virtually created the middle class in the country. The reason that we come closer together, you don't have the extreme rich and the extreme poor. You have a vibrant middle class with pretty extreme economic power collectively. There's an old saying in labor law that nobody ever got a union who didn't ask for it. And the way that the railroads treated their employees as if they were privates in an army at the beck and call of the managerial forces made it such that the only way that they could deal with it was to band together and form a labor organization.
If you look at the development of railroads, where they've come to a crucial point that they themselves are going to have to expand, grow, and be part of the marketplace, there is a generating force. It is the Civil War. It is because, in a military sense, the Northern leadership, Lincoln and his generals, not only did they have a vast majority of the railroad systems already in place in 1861 when the war broke out, but what is even more important is that they understood how to use railroads in a military sense. Well, it's not a big jump in logic to say if you put a military mind in charge of something, he will organize it in a military way, right? Easy. Which means that the modern railroad, as it was designed and developed, becomes hierarchical, authoritative, unilateral. I've always made the sarcastic remark that the only thing that railroaders don't do is salute each other. After the war was over and railroads were at the pinnacle of their development, they became the new corporations. In hindsight, at the end of the Civil War, do you know what every general wanted to be? He wanted to be a vice president of a railroad. Railroads were in a dominant position. The government was willing to do virtually anything. Lend them money, give them land, give them rights of way. They were willing to do almost anything to get them to build and grow. Now, when you're in that kind of a command position where everybody wants you and is willing to do almost anything to get you, it's a very easy step into beginning to become arrogant, to become avarice, to assume that you have something so magnificent that you can't, your judgment can't be even questioned. Railroads got into that. And I mean decades and decades of this. What it inevitably leads to, if you believe Lord Acton, and I certainly do, is a series of corruptions, a series of abuses.
As Jay Gould, who was one of the owners of the Erie Railroad, said, I can hire half of the working class to kill the other half. And if people didn't like the conditions and left, there were people lined up around the block to take the jobs.
Absolute power. And there was no one to check them, no one to hold them, because there was no government there that had either the intelligence or the strength of leadership to rein in these abuses, to rein in these obnoxious and destructive forces that were going on in American corporations. Let me give you a test. Name for me, from the end of the Civil War until the end of the century, all the presidents of the United States. Who stands out in your study? Who stands out in your memory of being a great leader between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century? Nobody. Nobody. You know, there's an old story that said it was cheaper to pay the death benefits of a railroad worker than to install the air brakes on his equipment. It was an economic question. There are 3 depressions in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Railroads as systems and workers within those railroads come into enormous bloody conflict in each of those 3 decades.
So after these series of depressions, in the spring of 1877, the Pennsylvania Railroad lowered the wages of its workers for the 4th time. And B&O, or Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, quickly followed. This was too much, and it became a breaking point for the employees.
And it just races across the whole railway system from the East Coast to the Midwest. Every major city has an upheaval.
It was extremely violent. There were workers killed by the federal troops, and it was clear that the government was not the friend of working people.
Only when an upheaval emerged, government began to pay attention to these abuses. The Pullman strike so frightened America, particularly the governmental leaders, that they realized that they couldn't put up with this again. Number one, it was a bloody mess. It was embarrassing to the government. I mean, bringing in the federal troops, shooting your own people, bringing in cavalry. I mean, in a democracy, that's hideous. That's obnoxious. And yet they felt themselves forced to do this. Secondly, a man stands out in the crowd. His name is Eugene V. Debs. He says to the workers, stop limiting yourselves to these craft unions that you've built. Engineers, trackmen, railroad switchmen, carmen. Unify, come together. Form one union, the United Railroad Workers. Do you know what fear he sends through the railroad community? You know what fear he sends through government? Finally, by the end of the century. Now you begin to hear presidents' names. If I named them, you'd know them. They begin to look at these problems. Their governments, their Congresses, their state legislatures at that time begin to look at these problems and say, whoa, 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 whoa. You've gone far enough. You've gone fast enough. You've gone over the line. We've got now to rein you in on these most obnoxious issues. Do the railroads lose a lot of money? Do they collapse? Do they fall apart over this? No. They said they would, but they didn't, of course. World War I is an incredibly wonderful boost for everything in America. It impacts the railroads unbelievably. The profits, the growth, the increase of technology during the war just explodes. And the other thing that happens is during World War I, some pretty enlightened guys take over in Washington and again understand that labor stability is needed. So you have the establishment of the War Labor Board. The War Labor Board is designed to handle labor problems so nothing breaks down.
Rail labor took its biggest leap with the seizure of the property of the railroads by the government during World War I. And that seizure lasted from 1917 till 1921.
The 1920s, which you and I always were told was the age of jazz and wonderful, happy time and so forth. For the working people of America, it was a disaster because all the expectations that had been developed by the war and all the money that was earned and all the laws that were passed and all of the things that they thought were going to improve their way were pulled out, were just jerked off the table. And the old ways came back. They fall back into almost back to the 1890s. Because now with the federal government not there supporting them, the old ways come back. The wage cuts, the long hours, the ignoring of safety rules.
And they began to talk to each other about the creation of a system for administration of rates of pay rules and working conditions. And after 5 years, they came up with what became the Railway Labor Act, which was essentially a collectively bargained statute that was taken to the Congress for approval. It's remarkable that the parties came up with this system themselves, took it to the Congress, who put its imprimatur on it.
And that was a law that said we cannot live without modern railroads. We must not have them blowing up in our faces every 3 to 4 years, or every time there's an upset within the economy. And so the first major labor laws that are passed in the United States have to do with railroads. See, railroads are always out front.
World War II was uneventful in rail labor history for a couple of reasons. Number one, there were the price control boards. Wages could not be raised except by proof that you were entitled to it before this board. And additionally, the rail employees, as all other employees, felt that the Roosevelt administration was on their side, and that if they would hang in there with them until Japan and Germany were defeated, that there would be better things around the corner for everything that they had to forego, as the entire nation had to forego during the period of World War II. So there was labor peace on the railroads during World War II.
War's over, 1945. The labor unions of the 1930s, however, are able to survive because the laws are there to protect them. The President of the United States in 1952 is a former General Eisenhower. A military mind, remember? What a military mind did to railroads and transportation in the Civil War? Well, this is a military mind who says one of the most efficient ways of being prepared for the next war is to build a transportation system that can move troops and people and equipment and war product as fast as possible. And the railroads can't do it anymore. They're not big enough, they're not fast enough. And he initiates and expands billions and billions of dollars in the development of an interstate highway program. It begins in the late 40s and the 50s. It is matured to being the most advanced international highway system ever thought of since the Romans. It signaled the decline of the supremacy of railroads. Technology changes the face of railroads. We go from steam during the Second World War, we rapidly move to diesels. And the impact of this on the long haul is efficiency, speed, reliability, cost savings probably. But for the labor unions, it also means you need fewer people to run the railroad.
In 1960, President Eisenhower commissioned a study of the necessity for the use of firemen on diesel engines. There was a great conversion from steam locomotives to diesel engines. The argument of the carriers was that there was no fireman required if there was no fire to tend. And there were a series of battles that began in 1960 through a commission report in 1962 during the Kennedy administration, all of which came down on the side that there was no necessity for a fireman to be aboard a train. It took 25 years, from 1960 to 1985, for the carriers to finally win the right to crew their trains with an engineer without a fireman. And even then, it was only by attrition.
The conductor, Mr. Owens, is in charge of the train.
The railroads, over time, lost their desire or incentive to provide passenger service, and to avoid a collapse of passenger service altogether, it being deemed to be useful socially that rail intercity passenger service be provided, the Congress passed the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1971. Rail labor was intimately involved in the passage of that legislation. In 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad got the authority to merge from the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was believed that this was going to create an industrial giant. Instead, 2 years later, the combined railroad, the Penn Central, found itself in railroad reorganization, which is essentially a bankruptcy court for railroads. There were 3 or 4 other bankrupt railroads in the Northeast. And to avoid a complete collapse of rail service in the Northeast, the Congress, at the behest principally of labor unions as well as various state governments, created a Consolidated Rail Corporation, or Conrail, that was to be owned by the Congress. And in 1974, the Conrail legislation was passed. Conrail actually went into operation on April 1, 1976. And the history of Conrail represents a very great success story, it seems to me. The contributions by rail labor, UTU in particular, to the legislation, the employees they represent, to the work that Conrail did, led to, in 1987, a scant 11 years after Conrail was actually created, that it was privatized and sent out to the markets. And only 10 years after that, that the Norfolk Southern and the CSX thought that it was a good enough property that they wanted to go out and get its routes and split them up. So Conrail was a case where labor helped the country rescue the essentially bankrupt Northeast railroads and make something out of them.
Every labor union in structure and organization has always been the mirror of the corporation with which it works, where it has its members. Therefore, if American railroads are merging, what should the unions be doing? The same thing.
I believe it's fair to say that the United Transportation Union was the first big step toward Deb's idea. In other words, the United Transportation Union is the embodiment of the idea that Debs had. The consolidation of bargaining power by mergers of unions could lead to greater results at the bargaining table. I think it's important that you remember your roots. Remember that this organization grew out of extremely overbearing conduct by carriers, and people realized, and particularly Debs realized, that it was only by banding together to concentrate your power, to have faith in each other, that you can hope to match the other side of the table. We have, over the last several years in this administration particularly, become extremely influential with agencies that we had previously not had much influence with, because we have changed our approach.
Charlie?
I don't believe that rail labor, and particularly this union, have ever been so influential with the Surface Transportation Board and the Interstate Commerce Commission before it, or the National Mediation Board, or the Federal Railroad Administration. We have figured out how to play the game.
There may not be a greater moment in the history of railway unions than today for those unions to be enlightened, well-led, and supported by their membership.
This union has brought you to the crossroads of history. You've sat here and listened to what has gone before you. That's history. This union has put you in a position in what it does before federal agencies, and what it does before the Congress, and what it does with the carriers, for you to have the opportunity to become part of history. The time for learning about history is over. The time for you to go out and make it is now.